let me turn to Christine Brim and get your insights into Elisabeth's case, and of course the many different meetings of the OSCE and these other gatherings in Europe that you attended over the years.
Well, I think that the distinction between a serf and a citizen is crucial, because Elisabeth was speaking and teaching and reaching out to people very much as a citizen of Austria. And one of the key things that makes The Truth Is No Defense such an important book is that there have been literally hundreds of people who thought, as a citizen in whatever country they were in, including this country, the United States, I have a right to speak out. I have a right to be critical of Islam. I'm basing this on facts. They'll come with their copy of quotes, and then they are treated as somebody who doesn't have the rights of a citizen that they thought that they did. Because when it comes to speaking about certain things, and the scope of those things keeps increasing, people don't have the rights, it turns out, de facto, that they thought that they did de jure. And in the chapter that we have on the press that Henrik Clausen and I co-authored, and I'm sorry he can't be here, he's a wonderful Danish analyst on all of these matters and is published widely for years. But one of the things that we touch on immediately is just a list of names. It is reading a list of names, and it's a selective list. There are so many that either we don't know about in detail or that we may just not have gotten the news on, of people who have been variously attacked and stabbed and shot and threatened and had people come to their doors, or they've been fired, or they've been silenced, or their publications have been confiscated. Their books have been withdrawn from publication anywhere. They've had their PayPal accounts and their Amazon Smile accounts and their bank accounts all canceled. They've been on every conceivable kind of hate list, like the SPLC, and they've been on blacklists and targeted, and this is global. It's not just in countries where these people are treated as blasphemers and apostates and are given death sentences. It's also in Europe, where they are treated as apostates and blasphemers, and indeed jihadists go to their houses or go to their places of work and beat them up and threaten them, and in some cases kill them. Those are writers, documentarians, public officials, and ordinary citizens who have educated themselves and want to share what they know because they thought they had the right, either under the UN Declaration of Human Rights or under the US Constitution, to do this. And when that happened, frequently, including in this country, their governments simply stand back. At best, the governments don't enforce the law. At worst, the governments become the antagonist, and they enforce Sharia blasphemy law on their own citizens, putting that in ahead of enforcing what people thought was the law of the land. And we see this happen again and again. Some individual goes out and does what they think is absolutely acceptable, and suddenly the force of the entire state, not to mention potential, terrorists in their own in the country, suddenly lands on them. And this book is unique because very few of these individuals, Geert Wilders, maybe a couple others, but very few have had the wherewithal, the knowledge, the biography, the writing ability, the support, the network to capture that experience. But lots of people have had it. And I think that what is unique in Elisabeth's case, and which was picked up by the media, not during most of the case, but very much at the end, when you essentially lost in October of 2018, and then it went for the final request for appeal. After some sort of desultory media attention over the years, suddenly people focused and they said, oh my gosh, this is actually happening. Because so many people thought, well, there's no way that this could actually go to the next court of appeal. And then again and again and again, it would. At the very end, we saw a lot of mainstream media, and I'm just going to mention them because I think it's important that it finally caught the attention, not just of human rights and free speech blogs and associations, although some of those were very important, but it got the attention of The Economist, The Atlantic, which actually covered it pretty extensively, The Washington Post, The Wall Street Journal, Le Figaro, Hollywood Reporter tracked this, was very concerned. Commentary, Washington Examiner, National Review, the Gatestone Institute, which is a nonprofit but which publishes regularly, had multiple articles, literally dozens of articles over the entire lifespan of this case, particularly at the end. And in Europe, think tanks really realized at this 11th hour that this was something that they should focus on. Maybe this was real. Maybe this was actually coming down, and free speech was in far greater peril. And the ability to be critical of Islam, or for that matter, and I would add this, to be critical of pedophilia, was actually now at a penultimate stage. And so we see the Institut Montaigne, the Young European Federalists, the European Journal of International Law, European Center for Law, which of course was central to your defense and was terrific throughout all of this. And there's a chapter in the book that's just wonderful by Gregor Popik, who's with the ECLJ. EU Law Analysis, the UK Constitutional Law Institution, group after group after group suddenly said, oh, this is happening, this is real, and we are about to lose to an absurd, incoherent, illogical decision, the right of free speech. And there were a range of interpretations, and some said, well, really the ECHR is just devolving the authority to make these decisions to the nation state, but others were saying, yes, but on the other hand, every blasphemy law that's in existence in many of these states still, although not being used by Christians, for whom it was probably originally created, are being opportunistically used by not ordinary Muslims who want to be good citizens, but by the Islamic activists of the particularly Muslim Brotherhood, who are professionals who are looking for opportunities to impose silencing and censorship of any kind of factual statement about Islam, which could reflect badly on Islam, which is the Sharia definition of slander, which is a different definition than our definition in the Western law. One of the things that came through in some of the analysis, I think, was that there were 3 tiers, I would say, of how people wrote about this, to the extent that people were scared to write about it at all, because they were afraid that if they did, they would be attacked. It's amazing that it got the coverage that it did. Many people only covered the free speech aspects of it. They did not refer to Elisabeth by name. She was at best, Mrs. S or ES, even though your name was completely out there in the news. They did not touch at all on the Islamic component. There were whole articles dealing with the free speech component that never mention the I word, Islam, and others that would touch on it and would say this is an absurd approach to narrowly defining pedophilia, and look at that aspect, but would never tie it in any way to the formal authoritative hadith about Muhammad's life, which does indeed say that he consummated his marriage with Aisha when she was the age of 9, and which is used as a model in incorporated law, in incorporated Sharia law in multiple countries within the Muslim world. And there's a section in this book that talks about that to some extent, because although there is a move, which would have been nice to have had the European Court of Human Rights recognize that a number of Muslim countries are actually making an effort, at least on the books, to outlaw child marriage and to put age of consent at 15 or 16 or 18 or something a little bit older. In fact, that's a real problem because, for example, in Afghanistan, only 5% of marriages are even registered. The guardians of girls and even of boys can overrule any personal decisions. Children are often married at a very young age. The consummation may be, at some other time. But the ability to track what's going on is limited. The fact that there are a significant 2 groups in particular that were stories that should have been told, that were never told relative to Elisabeth's case. There was a group called Girls Not Brides. It's an NGO. It's a global group. It's over 1,000 civil society organizations in over 95 countries that are working to prevent child marriage. that are working to prevent the rape of children, right, in the name of whatever doctrine is used. And they do not focus just on Islamic child marriage, but they are acutely aware that Islam presents a unique problem here because it is doctrinal in its approval of child marriage. And that's a group that absolutely could have been, the ECHR could have taken the side of the victims, and instead when they talk about denigrating a religion, or they talk about creating some sort of risk of a lack of peace in the community, all of which are phrases there, they're not talking about the children and the women and the girls who are victims of this doctrine. They're talking about the extremists who essentially will create problems if they take the side of the victims. So I think the other group that I would urge people to know about here is Women Living Under Muslim Laws, which goes by the French name Femmes sous loi musulmane, has representation in over 70 countries. Another group that's been around now for about 8 years, struggling again to assert the rights of women and children in Muslim countries. Again, a story that should have been covered, should have gotten out in the media, but because the ECHR took the side of the victimizers, not the side of the victims in Islam, and not to mention, of course, denigrating any kind of free speech, these were the stories that weren't told. I think I, like Steve, have a couple quotes that I wanted to read. I will read, if I could, just one, which was by a wonderful European expert from the European Journal of International Law. His name's Dr. Marko Milanovic, and he wrote an article called "Legitimizing Blasphemy Laws Through the Back Door," and he notes that the court engaged in a sleight of hand, as he calls it. He says, "Look carefully what happens here. Religious peace," referring to that phrase, "and religious feelings, which are not mentioned as legitimate aims for the limitation of freedom of expression in Article 10.2 of the Convention, become such under the guise of protecting the rights of others. Religious peace is then defined not simply as an absence of violence, which the applicant's statements were not held to provoke in the first place, but as some more nebulous idea of peaceful coexistence. Then finally, a person's religious feelings are neatly subsumed under the person's rights. In other words, I have a right for my religious feelings not to be hurt. And all this, right or wrong, is simply taken by the court at face value without any kind of critical reflection." And that's really the bottom line of the court's decision, and that's why so many people in the human rights and free speech community, in the press and in the think tank community in Europe and in the United States, realized how both incoherent this decision was, but how dangerous it is, because it says that the definition of hate speech or of denigration of religion is based solely on the other person's perception of hurt feelings, and therefore hate speech is defined solely by the person, not by anything other than the recipient. And that opens, obviously, the potential for a complete totalitarian shutdown of any criticism, not just of Islam, but of anything.